What's going on, guys? This is Tower number 9 coming to you with another Star Wars Unlimited commentated gameplay video. This time I am playing a interesting deck. I'm actually playing Chewbacca Command, inspired by the Chewbacca space deck that I was playing against earlier. I decided to kind of try my own version of it. So shout out to PatFan96 for inspiring this build with a Chewie command deck that he was playing earlier. If you want to see the games that I played against it with Vader command, you can check out an earlier video on this channel. I'll link it in the description below. But I thought that was a cool enough style of deck that I figured I would try my own version. So yeah, here we are. My basic strategy here is I'm trying to use Chewie and his strong defensive ability to hold my opponent off in the ground while I build up a big force in the air. So to begin with, my opponent's playing Han, ends up playing a C-3PO there, and I play an Alliance X-Wing. Now here we have a wing leader being used to buff C-3PO, taking him up to a 3-5, or I'm sorry, a 3-6. My X-Wing takes down the wing leader, remaining on the board thanks to its 3 HP. And we're probably going to see C-3PO attacking the base here. Yep, 3 damage. And does my opponent guess correctly? I believe my opponent did get the correct guess on the first turn, which is why they're up 1 card on me. I play Resupply here, putting that into play as a resource and ramping up to get to my bigger plays faster. And then this turn, a bit of an odd draw. I end up deciding I'm going to resource this home 1 since I already have 1 in hand. I am hoping to have home 1 be kind of my finishing move in this game. Getting that very powerful unit out, bringing something else that I've lost back, and putting on maximum pressure in space. But this turn, I think I'm going to try to play out another X-Wing and then play another resupply and ramp up even faster. So my opponent swings in with C-3PO, another 3 damage. And you'll notice that I am using the Death Star Command Center this game rather than the Energy Conversion Lab. I normally do think the Energy Conversion Lab is a better base, but I'm using the Command Center there because it has the extra health to buy me more time for a deck that has a game plan that might take a while and wants to stave things off. So one disadvantage of going for space pressure versus ground pressure is that space units are a little bit less efficient than ground units. And as a result of that, I've gone for the higher HP base to kind of give me that extra life total that I might need in order to survive against opposing units that are a little bit more efficient if it does turn into a space versus ground race. So my opponent plays Ezra Bridger, I play a second Alliance X-Wing, and then we're going to see yet another resupply and taking the build up to 6 resources, and I'm going to go to 7 here, which is going to allow me to deploy Chewie. So I'll be able to deploy Chewie pretty fast this game, which is always a nice thing, always a nice thing to have in your back pocket. That early leader deployment can often cause a real problem for somebody. My opponent deploys the Millennium Falcon here off of Ezra Bridger's ability. So when Ezra attacks, he can look at your top, after he resolves his attack, rather. So he does have to survive. But after he resolves his attack, you can look at your top card, and it is depending on what it is, you can choose to either play it, leave it on top of the deck, or discard it. So here I just deployed Chewie, 7 cost, 2-9, or 7 resource deployment, 2-9, Sentinel, and Grit. So not only is he a Sentinel, but the Grit means that as he takes damage, his attack gets even stronger, which may cause my opponent some problems here in the ground arena. We'll have to see. In space, though, that Falcon is poised to gain the advantage on my poor X-Wings there. However, I do have a Wing Leader, which could buff one of the X-Wings to take out the Falcon. I could also play a Takedown to just remove the Falcon directly. So I do have some answers for that Falcon, and Chewie here is Underworld and Wookiee. Unfortunately, not a Rebel unit, so I am not going to be able to buff him with the Wing Leader. Now, my opponent uses Han's ability to ramp up to or to accelerate up to 6 resources. This will allow him to deploy Han this turn, but it also means that he didn't take the immediate opportunity to attack with the Falcon. which is an interesting situation for me. I end up using a wing leader to buff my high health X-Wing. I sort of figure if my opponent wants to use the Falcon to clear the low health X-Wing, that's okay. Um, I can potentially trade the wing leader with it next turn, but now the high health X-Wing is in a position to potentially remove the Falcon. Arguably, it might have been better to play that X-Wing or that wing leader using Chewie's ability to force the Falcon to attack it, and then trade the low health X-Wing for the Falcon. Might have been a better option. Didn't end up going that route though, and Chewie deploying early with Sentinel does mean that the that C-3PO can't hit the base and get free damage plus the potential card draw. I still do have that takedown ready. My opponent has 3 resources remaining, likely going to deploy Han this turn. But Chewie is a big obstacle for him, which is kind of the way that I like it with this. One of the so Chewie deploying on 7 resources isn't as impactful as Darth Vader, but you do have the ability to cause a lot of trouble. As the Sentinel there is very disruptive to enemy attacks. And once you start taking some damage, you can potentially swing for really big damage on the enemy base. So in this situation, C-3PO hits Chewie for 3 damage, which actually powers up his attack. So Chewie now swinging for 5 himself. This does mean also that if my opponent deploys Han clashing with Chewie will take a lot of damage himself. Because my opponent didn't take the opportunity to push with the Falcon, I'll have my experienced X-Wing defeat the Falcon, and we'll see what happens next. So my opponent deploys Admiral Akbar, inflicting 3 damage on Chewie with that ability. This does now mean that Chewie is strength 8. So if Han were to fight Chewie, Han would actually die, and Chewie would too. But I'm going to take the opportunity to just swing in for 8 damage to the base. So Chewie getting big pressure on my opponent and actually putting me into the position of the life lead. My opponent opts not to deploy Han, just taking the initiative. That's a reasonable play. He'll be able to have one of his units trade with Chewie next turn without me getting another attack. I'm gonna send the X-Wing into the base, and then I end up playing Takedown to defeat the experienced C-3PO. Arguably, I should have played it on Ezra there, not sure. I think my reasoning was that Ezra's ability does not work if he dies making the attack, and C-3PO's does. So by killing the experienced C-3PO, it creates a situation where my opponent will hopefully not get value out of Ezra's ability because in trading with my Chewbacca, he won't be able to use the after your attack is completed trigger. Now, is it going to actually pan out that way? We'll have to see. But I believe that was my thinking. And even though I only have some relatively basic ships in space, this is something that can be pretty annoying with a lot of damage, represented by those ships. We have X-wing for 2, wing leader for 2, experienced X-wing for 4. That's 8 damage right there, which is getting my opponent into the danger zone further. I'm going to be able to play home 1 this turn. My opponent has a shoot first, which is a nice play. That's going to allow Ezra to take down Chewie. So Ezra defeats Chewie and is going to get his ability. So shoot first, attack with unit, gets +1/+0 for this attack, and deals combat damage before the defender. So because of that, Ezra defeats Chewie without taking any damage himself, and that means when he looks at that top card, he looks at that top card. He wasn't defeated, so he does get that ability, but he ends up deciding to put it back on top of the deck. Not sure what it was. Maybe a big unit that he can't play right now. Maybe something that just isn't very strong under these conditions, but doesn't end up getting a bunch of value there. I deploy Agent Callus, taking out Admiral Akbar and drawing a card. I'm not sure why I didn't resource. I think I should have resourced and just played home 1, but whatever. My opponent play because I feel like I can resource this R2 pretty easily here, but you know, my opponent plays Bright Hope to stall me in the space arena. That's a 2/6 Sentinel. And it does also have an additional ability that allows you to return a unit from the ground arena to your hand and draw a card if you do so. However, my opponent does not want to return his Ezra Bridger, which quite frankly is probably reasonable. So yeah, Bright Hope 4 cost 2/6 with Sentinel. When played, you may return a friendly non-leader unit from the ground arena to its owner's hand, then draw a card. Now the issue here, I decide I'm going to push through. I have my experienced X-wing and my wing leader just hit for 6 damage, defeating the Bright Hope and leaving my other X-wing free to hit the enemy base for 2. And one of the reasons that I do this is because I want to have my wing leader in the discard pile so that I can bring it back with Bright Hope this turn. Now, my opponent didn't deploy Han, and I'm not sure why. He may have just wanted to preserve the initiative that time, but I think that deploying Han would have been advantageous. Um, he could have removed R2D2 or Callus had he deployed Han, but that isn't what he opted to do. So he deploys a Wedge Antilles. 5/5 gives vehicle units ambush and +1/+1. I have Agent Callus defeat Ezra, and I draw a card. My opponent then deploys Han, and I have an interesting play here. I'm going to use R2D2 to hit Wedge for 1, and then I'm going to bring in a second Agent Callus to defeat Wedge with Ambush. And I believe this also will draw me a card because the different instances of Callus are different versions of the effect, even though the effect is once per turn. I'm not 100% sure, but that is the way that we played it for this game. My apologies to my opponent if that was wrong. Agent Callus, when another unique unit is defeated, you may draw a card. Use this ability only once per round. So managed to clear that wedge, and my opponent's Han does some damage to the base. He then plays Leia Organa Defiant Princess and exhausts my X-Wing. I'm not too worked up about that. Like, is it unfortunate? Yeah, sure, but it's not catastrophic. So in this situation, I probably want to keep resourcing just because I have so many cards in hand. And I'm not going to be able to play them efficiently, especially since some of them are expensive cards, like the Vanquish. So I'm looking at my discard pile there, checking some options. It's going to be home one this turn. So home one is it's the top of my curve, and it's kind of my end game super unit to try to close the game here. So I play home one. I bring back that wing leader that I had traded earlier, and I give experience to this damaged X-wing to allow it to push more damage. So home one, 8 costs 7/7 with restore 2 in space. Every other friendly unit gains restore 1, and when you play it, you play a heroic unit for your discard pile for 3 less. So potentially some huge value there with home one. And not only is it giving me a huge unit in the space arena, it's also putting me into a position where I have a lot of restore. So that normal X-Wing now has restore 1 thanks to home one's ability. Each other friendly unit gains restore 1. So it's creating a situation where I'm able to push damage through and also kind of recover some of the damage from my base, which helps with this race dynamic where we're both trying to close out the game before the other person can, with my forces focused on the ground and with my forces focused in space and his on the ground. Now my opponent plays a home one of his own. That is a big play. I'm happy that I defeated Wedge last turn because if he could ambush that home one with +1/+1 and destroy my home one, that would be like a game-ending play almost, in my opinion. And he brings in the Falcon. At that point, all I can really do here is take initiative. So my opponent heals 1. after hitting my base for 2 with Leia, and then heals 1 with a attack from the Falcon as well. So in this situation, we have to really think about what the best order for things is. I have a wedge Antilles of my own, but a little late. 10 resources here if I resource this turn. So one thing that I could do, yeah, one thing that I could do is I could stay on 9 resources. So I probably want to play, Vanquish to kill my opponent's home one. Um, and then the question is what else I want to do that turn. Fleet Lieutenant might be a good play. So Fleet Lieutenant and Vanquish I can play with my current cards. If I opt not to resource, I would really like to play Obi-Wan and Vanquish, but I can't do that because even if I resource a card, I will only be at 10 resources, not 11. I can probably resource this Wing Leader since it's going to be too slow. And then maybe next turn, if there is a next turn, I can do Obi-Wan plus Vanquish. We'll have to see. Um, so I start off by using Chewie's ability. So Chewie's ability allows you to deploy a unit with 3 or less cost, or play a unit with 3 or less cost, and it gains Sentinel. So I play this Fleet Lieutenant as a Sentinel, and at the same time, and I use the Fleet Lieutenant's ability to have my home one attack for major damage straight to the enemy base. And the reason that I do it like this is because that Sentinel is now blocking Han's attack from doing 4 damage to my base, and additionally, I am front loading my home one damage and the healing from home one. I was at 9 life, which means I actually could have lost immediately if my opponent had played a surprise strike or a fleet lieutenant on his home one. But thanks to the restore, I'm no longer in range. My opponent plays an asteroid sanctuary, exhausting my experienced X-wing and shielding his falcon, and then I vanquish his home one. Huge value there. And he does have some nasty stuff still. He probably has an advantage on with the in the ground arena. He has probably a substantial advantage. In fact, his Han can kill my fleet lieutenant, and then he can swing in with Leia this turn. In space, he can use his shielded Falcon to defeat my experienced X-wing and take no damage, or he can kill the wing leader that hasn't attacked yet, or he can just put more pressure on my base. But I have now gotten into a position where it's going to be a lot harder for him to actually. It's going to be a lot harder for him to actually win this. He does end up using Han to defeat the Sentinel guy there. That means that I have an opportunity to hit his base for 2 more damage and 1 more healing to my base, thanks to my home one still being up. I think it would have been more efficient to use the Falcon first. Leia hits my base for 2, and the Falcon hits my base for 3, but I have taken the initiative. So the question is, does he have some play that can somehow stop me from attacking the base and winning the game as the first action of the next turn? In theory, he could play a Bright Hope, return the Leia to his hand, and then have a powerful Sentinel, but he does not have a play like that and ends up indeed conceding the game. So, big value from home one there, ended up getting me the win. Along with my opponent's Asteroid Sanctuary there was a pretty reasonable play in some ways, but it ended up meaning that his home one died without making an attack, which was pretty crucial because a home one attack is 7 damage to my base and 2 life healed from his base. So that could have been really big. But luckily for me, my opponent went for the Asteroid Sanctuary first, preventing me from making an attack with my experienced X-wing, which is reasonable. But because I had a good counter to his home one, I think that ended up maybe being the wrong play. So this hand actually has some really good stuff. There's 2 resupplies there, for instance, but I don't have a turn one play, and I do want to have something to try to stabilize early or contest either arena early on in the game. This hand isn't great, but it's actually pretty reasonable here. So most likely I'm going to resource a entrenched, and I could resource Wedge R2 or the other entrenched here. I end up resourcing Wedge because he's kind of a later game card. And frankly, as it pains me to say it, but I don't feel that Wedge is that good right now. I like him as a character. I think he has some strong advantages, but I don't quite like it. I think it's a little bit like Dodonna, except worse in the present card pool because there aren't that many vehicles. There aren't that many vehicles that you're playing. There aren't that many, what's it called? There aren't that many ground vehicles in particular, so it's mostly for space. Then if you're playing a space deck, you're probably winning in the space arena. So like, yeah, I don't know. We'll see. He might be carved for the future with more vehicles and so on. Right now, Dodonna feels like the same thing, but better. I think I might be running both of them in this deck, but yeah. Okay, so my opponent used Han's ability to get an extra resource, then used that resource to play a resupply on the first turn. I played a restored Arc 170. So my opponent is ramped up very fast, but fortunately for me, does have to discard one of those thanks to Han's ability. So Han allows you to put a card from your hand into play as a resource. And so this is very strong, but the downside of doing this is that it does mean that there's another part to the ability where you then have to discard a resource. Um, and I believe it's at the start of the next turn. I don't exactly remember the timing, but it ends up kind of costing you it costs you a card to get +1 resources just for a turn. So sometimes that's important if it lets you hit like an important milestone, like an important cost breakpoint. Like maybe, it lets you play like a 3 cost unit on the first turn. Or maybe a common one is on the turn where you have 5 resources, you give yourself an extra one that puts you at 6. Then you deploy Han. Then if Han gets to attack, he puts another temporary resource in, putting you up to 7. And then you can play Rebel Han or Mace Windu or whatever. So in this situation, I play a wing leader and buff my restored arc. My opponent actually plays the Falcon, and I just use the restored arc to defeat the Falcon. So because I have the 2 experience there, I'm able to just directly take it out and remain alive, putting me in a significantly stronger position in space. Playing that Falcon did buy my opponent some time though. And if I had not attacked into it and killed it, he could have used it to attack my wing leader or just to put some damage on my base. So right now I'm feeling pretty decent about this. My opponent is ahead of me on resources, but I have the advantage on material and cards in hand. I've also drawn home 1, which could be a strong card later. My opponent plays a Leia Organa. Defiant Princess exhausts my experienced arc. I play the Homestead Militia, who do not currently have Sentinel. My opponent plays Ezra. So things that I can do here, I end up playing a R2-D2 using Chewie's ability to give R2-D2 Sentinel, which means that if my opponent deploys Han, he'll have to attack into R2 instead of the more valuable Militia, potentially allowing me to get some value. But my opponent actually doesn't go for the combo to deploy Han, maybe worried because he has so few cards available with just 1 card in hand, ends up deciding that he's just going to take the initiative instead. My wing leader hits the enemy base for 2, and we're going to see how things continue. Um, right now, I have a bit of an odd hand. The home 1 is not able to be played right now. I could play Vanquish, or I could also plausibly play Entrenched on one of my units in the ground arena and use that to fight my opponent more directly. Additionally, my Homestead Militia does not currently have Sentinel. And the reason for that is that I only have 5 resources and not 6. My opponent does opt to attack with Ezra into the Homestead Militia anyway, though, even though it isn't a Sentinel, and then ends up getting a C3PO on the top of the deck and using Ezra's ability to play it directly rather than putting it back on top or discarding it. So my opponent then misses the guess on C3PO, so doesn't draw a card, which I'm happy to see. I entrench my Homestead Militia, making them a 6/7. But because they've taken 3 damage, they are essentially a 6/4. Entrenched attached unit can't attack bases. But I'm not too worried about attacking the base. My opponent plays Bright Hope, and I think doesn't return anyone, which is a little odd. I think returning Leia Defiant Princess would be a really good move in this situation. The reason that I say that is that Leia Defiant Princess her ability could then be used to exhaust another one of my units. And the card draw would also be quite valuable given the small number of cards in my opponent's hand. I have the Homestead Militia defeat my opponent's. I have the Homestead Militia defeat my opponent's C3PO there. And now my opponent has the choice of what to do with Leia. Could attack me, could just do some more damage. Yeah, so he ends up just attacking with Leia into the Homestead Militia, doing some more damage. They're down to just one life. I'm gonna have R2 defeat Ezra, taking 3 damage, allowing me to look at my top card. I see a Bright Hope, which is funny. Um, I think I end up. So there's an argument that I should send this to the bottom because it's non-aggressive, and I want to try and like push the advantage here. There's an argument that I should take it and use it to send my R2 back to hand, which could get some value. I think I end up deciding, you know what, we'll take it. My opponent deploys Han. At this point, I can either take the initiative or try to attack with my space units. So my space units could attack into Bright Hope, but this time I think I would rather try and preserve them. My opponent plays Han and just attacks my base with Han. And because I have the initiative, I'm pretty happy with the situation. My entrenched Homestead Militia is going to be able to attack Han and defeat him at the start of the turn, preventing my opponent from getting value from that ability. And if the leader deployment ends up being 4 damage and a trade for a unit that has only 1 life remaining, I think I'm honestly pretty happy with that. I'm not saying this was like the greatest turn ever for me. I would prefer that Bright Hope not be in position to block my space arena, but overall I'm pretty happy with this. Also, I hit 6 resources, the Homestead Militia becomes a Sentinel, but that's not very relevant because I quickly trade them with Han. I would rather just have Han off the board. Um, I have my own Bright Hope, which I can play to protect my space units from my opponent's Bright Hope. I can also pull back my R2 and draw a card, which is pretty valuable right now. My opponent is accidentally, I think, selecting Han as well as the resource when he's trying to exhaust there, which is what's causing the confusion with this play. But it ends up being a General Dodonna. And so I play Bright Hope, which is going to not only shield my space units from his Bright Hope, but when played, I can return a unit to my hand from the ground arena and then draw a card. I return R2D2 to hand, which allows me to draw a card, and I'm still going to be able to play R2D2 if I want, because he is so cheap, and then get the ability to look at that top card and decide if I want it on top or bottom. Okay, so my Bright Hope has Sentinel, so now if my opponent attacks with his Bright Hope, he would have the advantage as he would do 3 damage to my 2 since his gets +1/+1 from Dodonna. But he opts just to take the initiative instead, so I play out the R2 that I had sent back to hand, and then I am going to pass. So my opponent has General Dodonna, giving his rebel units +1/+1. That's very strong. I probably want to remove that. So I could play the Vanquish that I have in hand to kill Dodonna. Another option would be that I could use Agent Callus to ambush in and trade with Dodonna and draw a card as well. Alternatively, I could I could do some other play. I could go for like Wing Leader. I could play the Wing Leader and the Consortium Star Viper this turn. I end up deciding I'm going to go like this. We're going to resource the Agent Callus here. My opponent plays a Wing Leader and buffs, I believe, buffs his Bright Hope. So that Bright Hope is now it is a 5/9 with Sentinel in space, which is a huge obstacle for me with the combined buffs of the Dodonna +1/+1 and the Wing Leader 2 experience tokens, each of which grants +1/+1. So I'm thinking about this, and I think what I end up deciding to do here is I'm actually going to use my removal, but I'm not going to kill Dodonna. I'm going to kill Bright Hope. So vanquishing Bright Hope here removes that huge obstacle from the arena, and now my space units have kind of free reign to attack the enemy base. Additionally, I could attack and kill my opponent's wing leader pretty easily, even though it has the buff from Dodonna. It would still die to one attack because it only has one base life. Um, my opponent has Dodonna hit my base, which is pretty reasonable. I deploy Chewie, who has Sentinel, and is going to hopefully block my opponent's efforts in the ground arena. My opponent does have an asteroid sanctuary there, exhausting the restored arc and giving a shield to the wing leader. I attack with R2 for 1 damage. See that I have a Dodonna of my own on top of the deck, I believe. Leave that on top. My opponent takes the initiative, and I have all my units just attack his base directly, dealing. So my opponent took 7 damage there. I think that was wrong. I think it should have been 6. Yeah, okay, so he corrected. 6 damage there, yeah, because Bright Hope, the wing leader, and Chewie are all two power units. So I have now taken the life advantage, and in addition, my board is substantially stronger, and I have a card advantage. This situation is feeling pretty good for me. Let's see how my opponent reacts, though. I'm now up to 8 resources also and can play home one. We could also see Dodonna. So we could see home one, and or we could see Dodonna plus one of the other units that I have here. So Fleet Lieutenant or Wing Leader could both be played as well as Dodonna this turn. I end up playing Dodonna. So 4 cost 4 other friendly rebel units get +1/+1. And that is going to create a situation where my units and my opponent's units are equally buffed, which you might think is even, but it's actually not because I have more units than my opponent, so I'm getting a bigger overall result. And additionally, I'm able to send my units into my opponent's base directly here, whereas he is kind of thwarted in both arenas by my sentinels. So I play the Fleet Lieutenant and buff R2 to attack my opponent's Dodonna, and because I have a Dodonna as well, R2 is able to do 4 total damage and remove my opponent's Dodonna. So Fleet Lieutenant, when played, you may attack with the unit. If it's a rebel unit, it gets +2/+0. So R2 had only one attack base, +2 from the Fleet Lieutenant, +1 for Dodonna, 4 total, removes my opponent's Dodonna. That's a good trade for me. 1 cost unit for a 4 cost unit, and it removes the buff that my opponent had going. My opponent does have Wedge in play, which is kind of an obstacle for me, but I'm thinking that because I have a strong Sentinel in the space arena, it's going to limit the impact of Wedge's ability with that ambush. My opponent does play another Asteroid Sanctuary, once again exhausting my experienced Restored Arc and putting another shield on his wing leader. 2 shields there now. Great Hope swings in for 3 damage, and my wing leader swings in for 3 damage, and then Chewie swings in for only 2 damage because he is not a rebel. He is unfortunately not buffed by Dodonna. However, I am, liking the damage that I'm adding here. I see another copy of Dodonna, which I probably don't need, but at this point also, do I want to keep resourcing? Maybe not. I am at 8 resources, which will allow me to play home one. It might be reasonable to resource that Dodonna though, because then if the Dodonna that I have on field dies, I can play home one and then bring back the dead Dodonna with home one's ability changing the cost. So the way that home one works is that it's not a unit with 3 or less cost. It's a heroic unit and its cost is reduced by 3. So if you have extra resources, you could potentially bring back, even like in some crazy situation, if you had enough resources, you could even bring back like a 7 cost unit and you would only have to pay 4 for it. My opponent ambushes in an X-Wing with Wedge, dealing 3 damage to Bright Hope and taking 3 damage himself but staying alive thanks to Wedge's ability. However, my opponent doesn't have any cards left in hand, so I know there's not going to be any more tricks forthcoming. And I'm going to just push damage through to the base, and I believe this is going to be enough to close out the game. So my opponent puts more damage on Bright Hope, but it's staying alive thanks to Dodonna. I swing in the restored arc, finally getting to attack after being exhausted over and over. And yeah, my units there are enough to close out the game. So interesting scenario. Ultimately, 2 wins for this build. My Chewie there in the ground arena was able to stall out my opponent's pressure there almost completely because he just didn't want to attack into Chewie and power up my grit. And so having that big sentinel that my opponent didn't want to attack, didn't end up attacking at all, kind of stalled out the situation in the ground arena and allowed my strong forces in the space arena to push through and get the win. So yeah, those were some games with the Chewie command space focused deck. Shout out to PatFan96, who I played against earlier, for showing me this style of build, and I will link the games that I played against this style of build um, in the video description below. I believe I was playing Vader command at that time. So I'll show some of what it might look like to play against this as well as what it just looked like to play as it. Okay, so that's going to do it for this broadcast, guys. Thanks for watching. And if you are interested in this type of commentated Star Wars Unlimited video, you can check out my channel. I have a lot more videos. I'm actually putting up a commentated gameplay like this daily. Additionally, if you're interested in written content, you can check out the fifthtrooper.com/blog, and I have an article written there that's kind of an introduction to various concepts in Star Wars Unlimited, why I'm enjoying it, like what I think is cool about it compared to other games, and also just kind of goes over the basics of what the cards do, kind of the anatomy of a card type stuff for people who are unfamiliar with the game. So I will link that in the video description below as well. Thanks again for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I'll catch you guys later.